Introduce my fellow panelists today as we discuss China's war on religion. We're going to be looking at China's suppression and persecution of the various religious groups in China today. We often have programs on China and religion, but they tend to be in our own little sectarian orbits. So today we're bringing people from various faith and religious spiritual streams together to talk about the big picture, about how China is really waging a war, not just on any particular religion, but against religion itself. And I'm joined by three incredible experts, starting with my own treasured colleague, Nori Turkel, who's going to be, he's at the Hudson Institute, is also a senior scholar. And Nori was actually born in a re-education camp in China. He eventually got out and got asylum in the United States and is the lawyer and is the chairman of the board of the Uyghur Human Rights Project, which he co-founded several years ago. He's also served as president of the Uyghur American Association. And then to his left is Dr. Sean Lin, who is director of communications for the Falun Dafa Association here in Washington, D.C. He is a survivor of the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, and he was detained in China due to his practice of Falun Gong in 2000. He was allowed to go to the United States under pressure from a U.S. campaign on his behalf. And in the United States, he became an Army officer and a microbiologist. So we're very lucky to have him here today. He served as the laboratory director of the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. And sitting next to me is a longtime friend, Professor Robert Destro. He recently served as the U.S. State Department's Special Representative on Tibetan issues and was Assistant Secretary of State on democracy, human rights, and labor. And currently, he is a professor of law at Catholic University. So welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I look forward to our discussion, and it's going to be more of a roundtable discussion than speeches or even different points of view. And I want to start with Nori. Tell us about this situation of genocide with the United States government, State Department, under two administrations, has now determined to be genocide.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nina. I wanted to begin by thanking you for your leadership on international religious freedom. You serve in the government now, still advocating for religious freedom around the world. I can't miss this opportunity to thank Professor Destro for his leadership in the previous administration addressing this very issue that you're asking me to address. I hope there was no genocide. I hope that people in Uyghur homeland live with dignity and freedom without fearful of the Communist Party. But we have an ongoing genocide, sadly entered its fifth year. And I'm grateful for the leadership that Professor Destro, Assistant Secretary of State, and others in the previous administration showed that the decision in of itself is remarkable. Not only it's a moral response, but it is a significant response that given the hope that Uyghur people have Washington's backing and the American people cares about their suffering. And it is also America's treaty obligation. People often talk about the Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, whether it's a genocide or not, but we overlook the Article 1 obligation that a state party to the genocide has a treaty obligation to call it out and stop and punish. So I am grateful on my professional and personal capacity for the decision that both for the decision made by the previous administration, confirmed by the current administration, but the international community still doesn't seem to get it. the genocide should not be a slow motion a process, as it has been in the case of the Uyghurs. It is disheartening that people in academia and a think tank, in some media organization, in some governments, still trying to figure out if the CCP has intention to commit the ongoing genocide. We don't need to pay attention to activists or even the victims. We just need to pay attention to what the CCP leadership has been saying. For example, they have been using terms like the organs of dictators should show absolute no mercy. This is Xi Jinping. And also the current Communist Party secretary said, round up, everyone should be rounded up. And they're also targeting specifically the Uyghur children. There are upwards of 800,000 Uyghur children that have been taken into the concentration camps. They have they call it boarding school. And also...
almost 2 million people have been taken.
Yeah, and then there's different numbers, but if you just pay attention to what the Chinese has been saying, 1.3 million Uyghurs have been sent through the re-education program according to their own white paper since 2015. If you add them up, you can come up with a staggering number. But the US government believes that there are 2 to 3 million Uyghurs. Most of them religious individuals, religious leaders, people who just wanted to have a traditional lifestyle that is immersed in the religious values. So it is, something horrific is happening, but the international community still has not really figured out the way to deal with it. And this genocide has an interesting aspect and unique aspect, which is the use of technology. The Chinese government initially started this social credit system to test it out in other parts of China, and it worked. And that social control surveillance become a very effective tool to the CCP now, and they have been able to use it. They're expanding to other religious minority communities. Instead of seeing the cross in the place of worship, you see tons of cameras. That has been one of the most effective. And they have this thing called facial recognition. They have the voice recognition. Recently, I hosted an author here at Hudson who wrote a book called We Have Been Harmonized. In that book, there's the lines about his visit to one of the technology firms. It says that we rule China today, but we will rule the world tomorrow.
Terrifying.
This is one of the companies that the United States government sanctioned by adding to the entity list in the previous administration. So technology, modern slavery, targeting on families, destruction of religious sites, and also changing the concept of religion have been some of the most effective ways that the CCP have been using in the Uyghur homeland.
Thank you. We'll get back to some of those points later on in the discussion. But Sean, I wanted to turn to you. Does any of this sound familiar to your community, or what are the distinctive ways that the government has come at Falun Gong to try to crush it?
Actually, way too familiar, and I feel actually pretty upset on the situation that the international society has not been responsive enough to the largest atrocities in China that have been lasting more than 22 years now. And so the Chinese government started a persecution of Falun Gong starting from July 1999. I actually want to say thank you very much, because you've been advocate for freedom for Falun Gong Buddhism for almost 2 decades now. And also appreciation to Mr. Destro, because you will spend time listening to Falun Gong practitioners appeal to the United States government, also Commissioner Terry.
So Falun Gong, for our audience, is a spiritual practice, a mind-body practice. Maybe you could say it better.
Yes. So it's a Buddhist systems, spiritual practice. In Chinese, we quite often call it self-cultivation to improve your mind and body. So this focus on the core characteristic of the universe. We call it truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. In Chinese, it's Zhen Shan Ren.
So that is your motto.
That's our motto.
That's your value system and principles.
Yes, and coupled with 5 sets of exercise to improve your physical condition. It's actually a very comprehensive improvement for your both mind and body and spiritual aspect. So when it spread out in China from 1992, it quickly attracted more than 70 million Chinese people following these practices by 1999. So this is one of the reasons the Chinese government feels threatened, because the rapid growth of the Falun Gong followers, and also because the spiritual teaching is totally different from the communist ideology. And so the former leader Jiang Zemin decided to crack down the whole group, so being lasting more than 2 decades. And the technology they use, the system that they use to persecute Falun Gong has been also cloned to many other religious groups as well, and from brainwashing, from torture, slaveries, and also even the forced organ harvesting. So many of the evil crimes that the Chinese Communist Party have been enacted upon Falun Gong practitioners has been pushed out to the society, to many different sectors. And just as the China Tribunal on forced organ harvesting in China have concluded, this atrocity happened in China is proved beyond reasonable doubt, and Chinese government have been killing a large group of Falun Gong practitioners, and Falun Gong practitioners is the major source of the victims of organ harvesting, also as well as the Uyghur group as well. And so
tell the audience what organ harvesting is precisely.
So basically, the Chinese government,
in the context of punishment, of course.
So in the context of punishment, they incarcerate a lot of prisoners of conscience, right, including Falun Gong practitioners and Uyghurs. So they can treat them as an organ farm. So when they are incarcerated, the government collect their blood type information, tissue type information, and build up a large database. So in the transplant centers, if they have a request for certain type tissues, blood type, or organs, they can search the database and then identify the person in the prison, and then they go kill the person, harvest the organ, and then ship to the transplant center, and then make profit from this whole process.
So there are living donors and unwilling donors of their organs. So these are detainees or prisoners?
A lot of our detainees and prisoners of conscience and different ethnic groups as well. And so Chinese government have utilized the police system, judicial systems, the medical system, working together to enable this chain of profits, a large industrial scale of organ harvesting. So it's a huge way to punish any different group of people being incarcerated inside China. And the government can now, in doing it, even if they identify a matching, they can go to your house to arrest you in any names and then harvest your organs.
It's absolutely ghastly and chilling. And the UN special rapporteurs on various human rights issues, women, prisoners, detainees, fair trial, so forth, came forward this summer, 12 of them. They did not have to do this, but they issued a press statement together, jointly, saying that they were alarmed at credible evidence that this is happening as a form of punishment against ethnic and religious minorities in China. And it is spreading. It is a spreading phenomenon. It maybe was pioneered with Falun Gong, and now is spreading to all the other ethnic and religious minorities, including the Christians, including the Uyghur Muslims, including Tibetans. So has the UN responded at all to that? The UN itself, have they taken any steps to respond to this extraordinary press release that their own independent human rights investigators have released?
It is actually a shame for the United Nations not to respond to this situation. And several years ago, a nonprofit organization called Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting actually raised millions of signatures and formally presented the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Several years passed, no response.
No response.
And at the same time, the World Health Organization even collaborated with Chinese government to set up a task force for organ and transplant basic procurement systems, right? So these task force actually include Chinese front figures, Dr. Huang Jiefu as a core member for the task force.
This is for an ethical oversight of the transplants, or what is this task force supposed to do?
Yeah,
Develop ethical rules?
It develops ethical rule, but also involved in the procurement of different organs as well, and set up the policies for different countries as well.
So the fox is in the hen house.
Yes, and
So
actually this idea was raised by Dr. Huang Jifu, by the Chinese government, and the WHO embraced it and then blindly believe the Chinese government will change, will reform. Just like if you believe in a vampire, will give up the habit of sucking blood from people. It's kind of ridiculous. Yeah.
Bob, you were the special expert on Tibetan situations at the State Department. What can you tell us about the Tibetan Buddhist experience?
Well, the Tibetan Buddhist experience is very much the same as what we've seen with the Uyghurs. It just happened sooner.
Happened earlier.
So basically what you have to do is look back to the 40s, when China first started coming in and taking over Tibet. And I think that Sean's point about the organ harvesting is also true with respect to Tibet, because Tibet it's a unique place. It's got a unique history, a unique language, a unique culture, and a very unique religion, which pervades all of it. But if you see Tibet as a very large prize, because basically, from my point of view, the Chinese government is an organized criminal enterprise. It's now selling the organs of its own people. And it's not just, it's the Uyghurs, were the brunt of the beginning of it, but it has certainly expanded. The Falun Gong have been very much involved. But just ordinary students are now disappearing too. Because once they have your DNA, they can match you right up with a transplant center. They're very, very proud of this. I mean, and that's a little bit of a talk we can have about strategy later. But what you need to understand about Tibet is that it's an area of incredible physical beauty and cultural richness. It's the source of South Asia's great rivers. It sits up on the top of the plateau, so it's incredibly geostrategic and environmentally important. It's the key to the Belt and Road Initiative. It's the key to Chinese, the Western military things, and it gives China control of both the military, because if you have your missiles up on the top of the plateau, you can hit anything. And it also gives China control of the key water resources of all the neighboring countries. Very strategic. And so Tibet was and remains today the key proving ground for all of the things we're talking about. It started up with the extractive, getting the minerals, getting the people under control, the coercive, forcing the Dalai Lama out, the repressive, the intrusive, the pervasive surveillance state.
There's even a 5G system, data collection system, on top of Mount Everest.
Oh, yeah.
Surveilling Tibet, but also collecting data from the rest of the world.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the reasons that the Chinese consulate in Houston was shut down is because it was a big spy operation on the medical technology community in Houston. So if you really want a nice kind of cogent one-word, descriptor of what the Chinese are up to, they're extraction experts. So basically they will monetize everything from the natural resources to your liver. And that's what we're dealing with. And anything that gets in the way, particularly religion, because originally Falun Dafa was actually pushed originally by the Chinese government as an effective way for people to get in touch with their inner selves. A lot of the training was done by Chinese embassies, and then the Ministry of State Security figured out there's more of them than there are of us. And then it started to get cut off at the knees. And to this day, the Falun Gong is perceived as an existential threat. And so is the rest of religion, but the Falun Dafa in particular, because they're Chinese and because
They're Han Chinese.
Yes.
And
so what you need to see is just recently it just came out that the Chinese government had a special forces group that literally went around the world to attack people. Well, we've known they've been doing that for years, and if you don't think they're doing it here, of course they're doing it here in the United States. So the question, what do we do about it?
That'll come later.
Yeah, that'll come later.
Yeah, but it occurs to me as I hear the three of you talk that really a case could be made for genocide or signs of genocide for all three communities: Tibetan, the Falun Gong, and the Uyghur. And these things have come, these attacks have been specialized and specific at different points of time, but there are a lot of similarities. I've been following the Christian situation very closely, and what I'm seeing is a two-pronged attack against it, and it's a fairly recent vintage. There was a crackdown during the Mao period and the Cultural Revolution, but Christianity really started to flourish, and to the point where the estimates range from 60 to 100 million. And so it's like Falun Gong in terms of numbers. And because it's seen by the CCP as overheated, they want to, either diminish it, to eliminate the numbers, to eventually get rid of it, of course, but to really reduce the numbers, and they do that through shutting down the underground, and they have banning all children, minors under the age of 18, actually applies to all religious groups, but it's going to hurt them all, from any exposure to Christianity or religion. So that eliminates a lot of people right away, which they of course enforce with surveillance and registration upon entry into churches. The other method that they use is to transform Christianity, to make it serve the Communist Party, to make it a branch of the United Front Work Department, so that it's hollowed out, and President Xi's speeches have to be the center of the homilies, the sermons. Xi's photograph is replacing Jesus Christ's image in the churches. At Christmas, instead of singing carols, they're singing patriotic songs. So in these patriotic churches, that's the government-controlled churches, they are now forced to really toe the line of the Chinese Communist Party. They have to adopt the values according to the regulations. Even the Bible there's a multi-year project underway to reinterpret the Bible, if not retranslate it. We don't quite know what it's going to look like. We've had some glimpses of this with a government textbook for older students, where they changed the meaning of a story in the New Testament from Jesus telling the adulterous woman to go and sin no more, to Jesus saying you have to obey the law, and then punishing her. So this is, again, the Communist Party position is that there is no mercy, that this is the law, you must obey what we say, even if it's not a good law.
Right.
And it's really shocking that they're going after the Bible, the very sacred text. They're appointing the leaders of the Catholic Church, and despite this agreement with the Vatican, which has gotten quite a bit of attention, the Vatican seems to have gotten very little out of it. There's a bishop in Fujian who was one of the new appointed bishops by the CCP, and he really exemplifies the model new Christian leader. He, upon being appointed, he marched his diocesan priests into a socialist institute center, with great deal of fervor, saying that we are going to follow the path of socialism. We're going to be re-educated so that we can follow the path of socialism. So Cardinal Zen of Hong Kong, who's so esteemed around the world, he said it's like being put in a little bird cage, that there is no freedom of religion. In fact, Christians who don't go along with this program, Christian leadership is being picked off by the CP. You don't see huge numbers like the Uyghurs all being put in detention camps for re-education, but you do see that with the leaders who don't go with the program. And they are being put in black jails, which is a form of detention where you have no idea, no rights, no due process, no access to lawyers, no sentence, no trial. And people who've emerged from them said that they were put for months or years. There was a group of priests that were put there for 6 years. There's somebody else who recently got out of 8 months in a basement with no windows for 8 months, where they were questioned around the clock. They're subject to struggle sessions and white torture, which is the kind of torture that doesn't leave scars. So sleep deprivation, or maybe some beatings that, the bruises go away then before you get out. So there is that brutality, but it's basically this high-tech surveillance and the supplanting of the leadership and the sacred texts and the imagery and the architecture with communist-approved examples. Some of the Protestant leaders have been put on trial. They have received sentences of 7 years, 9 years. I'm thinking of Pastor Wang Yi or Jonathan Cao, who is actually a resident of North Carolina. But for the most part, I think because the Chinese party, the Communist Party, and leadership is afraid of losing Western trade and benefits, they don't want to do to the Christians what they've done to the Uyghurs, what they've done to Falun Gong, and to the Tibetan Buddhists in large numbers. They don't want to be graphic. They don't want to have the images. They don't want to have the martyrs at this point. So they are suppressing and supplanting Christianity by high-tech means.
I think you've missed one piece.
Yeah.
And that is the way they're working in the West. And so if they can't get it through the extraction methods and the repressive methods, they'll buy it. And so I would suggest very strongly that as we look at things to do down the road, we start looking at following the money. Because we know here in the United States that the Confucius Institutes were put into American universities, that you said you thought the Vatican didn't get much. I suspect they may have, but not in the tangible things we're looking for, but perhaps under the table.
I don't know about that. I mean, I think that there's a great deal of surveillance. There's surveillance of the Vatican. The Vatican has technology that can be easily penetrated and has been. And, we had a cardinal who's been defrocked now, McCarrick, who was over in China 8 times staying in a Chinese government seminary. There is a lot of blackmail potential there. So I think that has to be a real consideration. But I'm glad you brought this up about manipulation. And we talked a little bit about it. But I think we need to, I think we need to say more about, Sean has brought up the WHO and how China has worked assiduously to manipulate the organ transplant oversight and rules and guidance for the world.
Yeah, I think they keep pushing out new narratives for their slides. Just for organ harvesting. At the beginning, they claim in early 2000, they claim we are not using executed prisoner. When the claim was so widespread and mounting evidence, so they say, all right, we do use executed prisoner, and then later it still doesn't count.
That's right.
finally say, oh, we need to establish a organ donation system, right? And then they try to bring in the WHO, bring in the transplant society, the medical professionals, in order to systematically brainwashing the world, saying, oh, China is doing reform. So they changed the narrative.
They changed the narrative. They were saying initially that it was death row prisoners that had been executed, and then the numbers
still doesn't match. Still doesn't match. And another important aspect is the media, because the Chinese government has systematically expanded their megaphones overseas, right? So they influenced even New York Times, Washington Post in the United States, right? So, and Falun Gong issue to them is always taboo. The Chinese government said, don't mention about Falun Gong issues. And so you will see very, very little media report. I think at the beginning, if the Uyghurs concentration camp was not exposed through satellite image, the Western media won't even expose it too.
That's a very important point. It's the and Nori, maybe you could speak to that about how the evidence. It's a news blackout for the most part in China on these atrocities. It's very difficult to get a constant flow of information, but we were able to determine the Uyghur genocide because of satellite imagery that showed this massive complex of detention camps, and then there was also population statistics. Can you talk up to that?
So you're right that the Chinese government had kicked out literally most of American journalists from China for the first time. That Washington Post in the last 20 years does not have any reporters in China. Their reporters reporting from the neighboring countries. So this kind of retaliation started way back. That made it difficult for journalists to go and report. But as you accurately pointed out, the satellite imagery initially identified by a Chinese law student in Vancouver, and then the open source information about the poverty alleviation program that they're using as a justification for forced labor practices, and also the white papers that they published, and then the population statistics. So in a way that they were shooting on their foot by releasing some information for the purposes of propaganda that actually validated much of the concern.
And that, just to revisit that population growth charts that they released, they showed that in certain Uyghur areas that there was fewer children, smaller growth than the rest of China. Right. It was very disparate.
So I was born and raised in the region until I finished my college education. So the family planning of forced abortion was in practice as I grew up. So it's not something new. But what is new is that they are going after middle-aged women. I've interviewed several of those middle-aged women who were subject to, talking about 51, 52-year-old women who had no plan on conceiving another child. But the government is so fearful and so brutal, they even subjected middle-aged women to forced sterilization. So it's not something new. As you may know, that they had always claim that we have a preferential treatment, but that preferential treatment, allowing the Uyghurs to have 2 children, also has a condition. You have to have a prior approval, and you have to have a waiting period between the first and the second child. But that's a story, that's a history now. So what is so significant about this current revelation is that in just last 2 years alone, they prevented birth rate by almost 60%. That is a staggering number. Yeah, and this is based on the information that they put out. This is not made up by American scholar or German scholar or U.S. government.
It's from the government data.
That's all.
That's been
and
open source.
They removed it ever since, but it has been written, documented. So it's indisputable that the Chinese government on a mission to destroy the Uyghur nation.
Yeah, so over a couple generations, there won't be any Uyghurs. I mean, if this keeps up like that.
Even the ones that have been compliant may not be fully look like the Chinese, because physically, culturally, traditionally, Uyghurs are very different. They're Turkic people. And also they are Abrahamic believers. It's very difficult I need to point out something in relation to the previous points that you all three making about CCP. CCP historically managed the religion, but now they're trying to either change it or destroy it. So the syncretization of religion in China, in a way, to the Chinese government to create a new type of religion. You cited the Bible. Yeah, they're particularly fearful of Abrahamic religion because they call it the Western religion that comes with the values that goes against the Chinese Communist Party ideology. And now we have this new thing called Xi Jinping thought that does not really go hand in hand with the Western religion. So they're primarily targeting the Western religious practitioners. The Tibetans and Falun Gong practitioners have been subject to various forms of human rights religious persecution, but as you pointed out, but the new trend is just to target those who have connection to the other religious practices outside of China.
Yeah, they have a different reason or rationale for targeting each group. But when you telescope out, they're doing similar things to different groups. Who could be more Chinese than Falun Gong? I mean, it's an offshoot of Buddhism, and it's not an ethnic minority. It's majority Han, and it's perfectly consistent with Chinese traditional values.
Yeah.
But they fear, I think, they hate and fear any kind of ideology or value system that is different from their own CCP standards.
If I may, there's an important angle in that. To the Chinese Communist Party, any organized religion, any practice of religion or belief is perceived as a threat. It used to be perceived as a sign of disloyalty, that you're supposed to praise the motherland, worship the Communist Party, but now they're perceived as a threat for the survival of the CCP. Back in 2013, Xi Jinping's secret speech was released that has a very specific line. It says so-called religious freedom is a threat. We need to push back. They specifically focus on three things: religious freedom, freedom of speech, and freedom of press. That they specifically, when the Communist Party leadership delivers speeches, every word matters. That's essentially a policy statement that sets the tone. So people wrongly sometimes kind of irresponsibly claim that what is happening in China to religious minorities is something connected to what they have done. It's not true. This is based on the perceived threat that the Chinese Communist leadership
and I would
possess in
add
their mind.
freedom of association as well, because religion encompasses all of those things: thought and speech and exercise of your views and association. There is no other really civic society group that I know of in China that within their group shares a worldview or a value system that's a life-guiding value system, like these religious and spiritual groups, and that have an infrastructure of an organization. There really isn't any civic society. I don't know, Bob, do you find that? Or
Well, yes. I mean, I think
outside the party, I should say.
Well, outside the party, no. I mean, the only thing that's remotely comparable, but it's really more like the party, is the big business. I mean, because it's all centralized. You want centralized. You want to maximize profit. You want to maximize control from the center. And so I think that, for audiences who are not Chinese, you're well advised to pay attention to the book Total Warfare, because the whole thing is making everything subordinate to the party. And that includes, by the way, American tech companies and American banks, because historically, if you go back into the history of China, it was never an expansive empire, like other empires were, like Napoleon or the Roman Empire. But it was a tributary Basically, it was you could go ahead and do what you wanted. You could make your money as long as you paid tribute and you did your kowtowing. And that's what they want. They want, if Amazon will kowtow, then they'll do it. If they won't do it, then And what I fear is that what has happened to these three communities, Tibet, the Uyghurs, and Falun Gong, is that's coming to a community near you. Because now you're looking at American high tech with Chinese characteristics.
Right.
So this assertion of control. It transcends just the boundaries.
It's a
of
model.
China.
It's an alternative model of life and existence that the Chinese self-consciously are competing against the liberal democratic model.
Right.
In 2018, there was a column published in the state-run media in China, specifically said that don't listen to the Western governments. Their messages to those despots, this authoritarian leaders around the world. Watch our model. We can show you a few things. It's seamless. It's painless. We don't go around and bomb cities and destroy communities like the Americans did, but we have a better way. Follow our model's a better one. So they're actively promoting. As of late last year, more than 80 countries already adopted Chinese surveillance technology. What does that mean? That's directly threat to privacy, human rights, and religious freedom. More importantly, threat to democracy.
So
But I think they kind of serve it from two aspects, right? So first, they do the total war against different religious beliefs. So they want to control your mind, your spirit first, right? Regardless different religions, they can use different tactics. And when they control your mind and then support it with technologies, so you can have a micromanagement. So Chinese government actually starting from Xi Jinping time have been pushed out one concept, it's called grid management. Grid management. So it's treating the whole country like a large internet system, so many grid points, right? So now they even down to microgrid management.
Grid management.
Grid management.
Let's talk about the social credit score system. I know that in the Christian churches, it's begun. They actually have it in the May 2021 rules on religion, that when you enter a house of worship, you have to register, you have to be in the register, and they have a system, they explicitly state, a system of rewards and punishments for each of the leaders of these houses of worship. So the rewards and punishments can be, again, they're very invisible. It's not like they're going to, have photographs of people being tortured lying around, although they do that in places like Xinjiang when they can get away with it, or they think they can. But they will cut off your heat and water and electricity in the middle of winter. And they did that to a Catholic bishop who wouldn't sign the pledge allegiance to the party. They will stop a Protestant pastor from boarding a plane out of Beijing. They prevented his daughter from attending law school in the United States, where she was planning to go. Others are deprived of being on the list for public housing or other health benefits, or getting on modes of transportation. Since they have so much control and it's digitized and it's all high tech and they have facial recognition, they have gait recognition, they can identify who's doing what with quantum computing. It goes into the government database in real time, and you're shut out and you're marginalized to the point where you can't survive. You cannot get health care. Your children cannot go to school, even inside China. You may not have housing. I even saw that on dating apps, they require the social credit score, because you could ruin somebody. You could be ruined if you were associated with someone who also had a bad credit score. You could get a bad credit score for being with that person. So they had promised to bring that out on every person in China by, I think, this year. But that hasn't happened. Is there a future in the social credit score system in China? I know it's being practiced on the religious groups. and religious communities, at least with the leadership. Have you heard of it being spread more widely? Because that was their ambition, but I don't think it's happened.
Well, I think it's happening. I mean, that many people think of for example, one of the things I worked on at the State Department was the Great Firewall. And people think of it as kind of a Berlin Wall. It's not. It's kind of it's almost like a plasma, like when you see in Star Wars the force field, that it shapes and it shifts. And it's always measuring and surveilling who's coming in, who's going out. And what that is that net is gradually shrinking. So you had it around the country. Now it's getting down to the part around people. And we're seeing the emergence of that here in the United States as well. The deplatforming of people is social credit scoring.
Canceling.
The canceling culture. There's about to be a release of a credit card here in the United States where they will give you carbon credits. That's social credit scoring.
Yes.
And this question about, are you even the vaccine passports are like that. You can't go out. You can't go to school. Today I saw in the newspaper you can't get an organ transplant. So I mean, this whole idea is unless you play by the rules, then we're going to take things away from you, which is the antithesis of the idea that human rights are given to you by God. And that you're born free and you're born equal. Everything is a gift of the government, everything is a gift of the party. And so you either play by the rules or you don't play at all.
It goes beyond playing by the rules. It's also being enthusiastic, proselytizer of Xi's sayings. I mean, they have removed the 10 Commandments from some churches in China and put up Xi's sayings instead. I mean, it's being fervent. It's championing a cult of personality almost. Well, that's the way I see it.
No, it's exactly right. I mean, a long time ago, when I went to Russia for the first time, I spent some time with a judge in Moscow. And he said, and he was talking about how he really wished the judges could be independent. He said, but they control the keys to my apartment. And so if I want a bigger apartment, he says, they're not going to say I must do this. I just know that unless I do that, then I will never get another apartment. I mean, so this is a classic communist way of controlling people. And the more subtle, you use the term white torture. I mean, this is just,
It's a bloodless, invisible way of behavior control.
Right.
Self-censorship
There's
as
also
well.
Another interesting aspect about the Chinese society and the government practices. One, under Xi Jinping, even those who have a tendency of this judge to do the right thing have been scared. Based on various reports, Xi Jinping put away about 500,000 Chinese cadres with accusation of committing corruption, being corrupt, or other unethical behaviors. And also because of the surveillance, the general public cannot even express their grievances for the social credit system, for being punished, not for in a criminal sense as the other religious and ethnic minorities. And one other thing that is very important to note is the word 转换 in Chinese is transformation. That transformation can be seen as a human reengineering for the religious community. The transformation, this comes from way back from Václav Havel used to talk about this a lot. Transformation is brainwashing. So now that transformation is to force you to give up your religious belief, your way of life, your language, your culture, and adopt what has been promoted as Xi Jinping thoughts in the schools that you mentioned earlier. So it's about transformation, it's about forcing people to get used to it, and also making people to be submit to the state. Well, so these are the methods. This is the difference between the other surveillance technologies being used around the world.
Yes, with enthusiasm. And there's that reminds me, there's an app that the government is requiring for certain categories, like Communist Party members, but also teachers now, widespread, study the great nation, it's called. And it's she sayings and others, I guess, principles. And the user is supposed to memorize these and then be tested on them and scored on them, and then that enables them to stay in school or get a better job or get a promotion in the party or whatnot. And it's spreading. Even some corporations are applying it. But that's not even the worst part. It has a back door with super user access into the data of the user.
I interviewed camp survivors. One of the common things that I've heard from them is that who is your savior? The motherland, the Communist Party. Who is your God? Xi Jinping. So when you force people who have been practicing a religion, believing in God for so long, to switch to a human being, that in of itself is a tremendous torture.
What can the U.S. do? What can we do? What can Americans do? What can the West do to stop this? One of the things that occurs to me is information, that we need to have an exchange of information with the people of China directly, and with our communities. But and that's not so easy because of this Great Firewall. And it's shrinking. There's opportunities of visits and entire areas like Xinjiang that may be cordoned off, and you can't even get there. And the Post is no longer there. Washington Post is no longer there.
Right.
What can we do to keep information open? During the Cold War, we were able to get information through samizdat literature that was handwritten and smuggled out across borders and translated and disseminated. Are we going to be able to do that?
Yeah.
I think it's good. You want to go ahead?
Go ahead.
No, I think that this is one of the areas where the infiltration, and I would say with respect to the Falun Gong in particular, the Falun Gong runs one of the best information networks anywhere. I mean, they are able to get things in and out that virtually nobody else can get in and out.
With the technology.
Yes, and it's relatively primitive by comparison to some of the stuff we've been doing with the firewall, but it's extremely effective. But when you try, as I did, to talk about empowering the Uyghurs and the Falun Gong, you would see the impact of the subversion of China's influence operations here in the United States. You would hear American human rights advocates talking about how the Falun Gong was a cult. And to say, wait a minute, where'd that come from? And so they will impose. So what you have is much like I saw on a day-to-day basis in the State Department, this fear that if you call it genocide, or if you call it subversion, or you call out, you actually put the clamps on the Houston consulate. They said, well, you don't want to antagonize the Chinese. You don't want to cut off the money to the WHO, even though it's owned and operated by the Chinese, because it's and so what I would suggest is that we need to pay close attention to strategy. A genocide declaration is great as a symbolic thing, but denying Chinese organ harvesting doctors access to Europe and the United States and getting, weeding
those
out
kind of sanctions and visa denials, the Magnitsky.
But also cutting off their publications. I mean, if you're murdering people for livers and then writing in the Lancet or whatever it is, I'm not suggesting the Lancet did it, but they're writing in all these journals saying, look, we're really great. The Falun Gong has done some phenomenal reporting on the green zones in the hospitals, of the morgues with people who've been cut open. I mean, I'm deeply involved in that discussion now, and we have to get that out. But we have our own troubles.
It's so unethical that it's beyond the pale, and we should definitely have a campaign to do that, like you said. There's also an asset, and Nori and I were in a meeting talking about this yesterday, I think, about students, Chinese students, coming to the United States, thousands of them, and do they know what's going on inside their country? Shouldn't we be telling them? And how do we reach them? And that also brings to mind these insidious Confucius institutes that are on campuses to spy, I think, that's what I've understood, to spy on students and intimidate them and to propagandize for the CCP. And I think the Trump administration tried to require reporting by the administration, by the campus, the university administrations to whether they had this Confucius Institute on campus or not. And that has been withdrawn early this year by the Biden administration.
They also have them in high schools.
So
even in high school.
Even in high schools.
Where, in California? Or?
All over. You'd be surprised
nationwide.
at how many. They're literally all over. And remember that the Chinese students pay cash. And so these institutions become very dependent on the cash flow. And so that's why, if you were going to start doing some sleuth work, you're going to really need to follow the money. Wherever Cardinal McCarrick was involved, there was always money involved,
yes.
as well as other things.
Well,
And also, sorry.
How do we get to the students, the Chinese students who are coming to this country, coming to the West for education? How can we reach them and say, you're the future, you're going to be impacted. Do you understand what your government is doing to your countrymen or will be doing to you?
I think more than just the Chinese students, a lot of Chinese immigrants as well. How do you reach them? Because we can see the Chinese government have a very effective way to reach them. For example, they can buy a stream box from the Chinese supermarket or on the Amazon. And once you buy that stream TV box, it can stream dozens of channels, 24 hours, broadcast from China directly. So the Chinese student and Chinese immigrants, even though living in the United States, they've been brainwashed by the Chinese government all the time.
That's the news they're consuming.
Yeah,
It's from
so-
the Chinese channels. Yeah.
So we need to cut off these.
And we also need to look at, you don't get to come here unless you have a social credit score. So human rights advocates in this country need to understand the dynamics of social credit scoring and what it actually means. Because I would love to know with the Chinese students who come and even with the immigrants who came with the blessing, the business people, what do their social credit scores look like? And how are they selecting people out?
Yeah, this will be
So
an important task for the Department of Homeland Security as well. I think it's so many Chinese Communist Party members coming out in order to transfer their wealth as well. So it would be good to have additional layers of vetting to see what kind of a social credit system that they allow for the student or business people to coming out.
Should we be inviting business people to come out and start their business here in the United States?
I think overall, just need to, just like some of the immigration officers have been doing, checking on Chinese students' social media platforms, see what kind of language they use. Are they supporting the Xi's thoughts or Mao's ideology, right? You need to check on this system. But overall, I think the Chinese government being very effectively brainwashing overseas Chinese. And the Chinese CCTV, Chinese version have been broadcasting all the cable networks, satellite TV, stream TV box, all the platforms, or any independent media are not allowed on this platform unless you have a big money to do it, right? So the Chinese government being infiltrated in the Chinese media, in the United States media landscape very dominantly. So if we do not change this situation, the Chinese American just being incubated as an espionage all the time.
So what should we do? Should we have Fox News or some other news broadcasts translated into Chinese?
That's one way, and at the same time, you can also include in like New Dynamics televisions or Epoch TVs in these satellite or cable TV networks. So at least the Chinese people see alternative voice, right? And also you need to ban those streaming TV box because those not just entertainment channel, they are like intelligent box. They are collecting the customer information from the United States.
And they're sold in where? On Amazon?
On Amazon's and and also there are many Chinese companies selling it and promoting it in the Chinese supermarket too.
Right, and we also have to get to the people in other countries that are signing on to the Chinese initiatives. And it's almost like when we sign on, and I'm not making the analogy, but it's basically, look at what we'll do for you for free. But then you never see what the cost part of that equation is. I mean, so I have friends in the Caribbean, for example, who say, well, we're concerned about Chinese influence in Jamaica or in Central America. And you say, well, look, are you sure you understand what the Chinese expect to get out of this? Don't look at it necessarily as a defense threat to the United States. This is always about China Inc. That's why I said this is an organized crime family. So if you think that your sugar is going to stay in Haiti, it's not. It's going to China. Your coal is going to China. It's an extractive.
Well, look what has happened to Hong Kong. Here is this agreement between the UK and Beijing for one country, two systems that they completely violated, demolished. And then, the Vatican goes and signs its own agreement with China, thinking that they would get a better deal or a fair deal. I mean, China has no compunction about breaking its agreements, even after the other side has fulfilled their end of it.
Well, I can tell you from...
And there doesn't seem to be a real ethical...
No, there isn't. In fact, American law firms, I mean, I can say this as a law professor, I've done some research into this, that American law firms rarely spend the money to get the Chinese version of the contract that they signed translated into English for their own clients. So they have even the English language contract will say that in a case of dispute, the Chinese language governs. And they've never translated
it's a rigged
the
system
Chinese.
dealing with the CCP.
Right.
Nori, I'll give you the last word. We're out of time, but
thank
please.
Thank you very much again for bringing us together to discuss these important issues. I would add two other aspects of American life that is also critically important. One, the recognition. We got to be careful when we're addressing China or Chinese. We need to keep the focus on the CCP, the main culprit, and all those violations we've been discussing. And then the other thing that we need to be mindful is that the corporate complicity in this business. I've heard from members of Congress, administration officials directly, that business community has been unleashed at the request of the Chinese to lobby against our own government. A case in point, there's a anti-slavery bill, Uyghur Forced Labor Act, that has been pushed back by members of business community, American Chamber of Commerce, lobbying against that bill. Several other global brands has been implicated. Anyone who can do a basic open source research can find out the names of those companies. So the American business community need to get on the right side of the history.
The Bible printing business is basically monopolized by Amity Press in China, which at the top of the totem pole is the CCP.
Right.
And they are actually the Bible publishers here in the United States, like HarperCollins is a big Bible publisher, and Christian Bible publishers are using this printing press and for all of their Bibles, and they produce about 20 million a year. They print 20 million a year in China. So it's 85%, 90% of American Bibles. And when the Trump administration put tariffs on China, those Bible publishers were in Washington lobbying against tariffs on China.
Right.
And they said it would violate our First Amendment right because we wouldn't have Bibles. That was the rationale given about why they were in Washington lobbying against tariffs on China. So it's a very dangerous situation. There's strategic industries, as we found out during the COVID pandemic. There's the pharmaceuticals there that we're dependent on them for that as well.
It's un-American and it's unconscionable.
It's unconscionable.
It's hard to fathom that American corporate community, American businesses, don't even understand that slavery is no go.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we need to get our information out, and I think that the American people and Congress should be looking very closely at what is happening to each of the religious communities in China, because they're one of the few examples of an independent sector, of a truly independent sector that has an ideology and an infrastructure and value system, an overarching value system, life value system that is different from the CCP. And look what is happening to them. These are being pioneered on these communities, and as Professor Destro said, it's coming to a place near you if we're not alert to it. Right. Thank you all very much for joining me
thanks for
today.
having
Thank you
us.
very much.
Thank you very much.